Hope, the gift of letting go. Recently, I visited the Greenwood Rising Center in Tulsa, recognizing the 100th anniversary of the Tulsa Race Massacre. Hope is what keeps them going, keeps them telling the story and moving toward one place, Tulsa, with a rebuilt Black-owned community. After I've done all that I can do, I turn results over to hope, a spiritual discipline. The Oklahoma Humanities most recent publication devoted it to the topic of hope. We need it in our time. As a 12-year-old girl, when a tornado cloud threatened our farm in Ouachita County, western Oklahoma, my father would send the whole family to the cellar, but he would watch the clouds looking southwest out the back door. Protected by the cellar, hope really was the only support we had, the primary support we had. Hope that the cloud would follow the usual tornado alley and miss our farm. Then there was hope others had for me. 7th grade civics in a rural community that President Kennedy's Strategic Air Command Base, Clinton Sherman Air Force Base, had just opened. A teacher from the base came to our expanded school. She had just moved back from Japan. She discovered that the rural kids had never been to the Oklahoma Capitol. So she got permission and piled us into her new pink Cadillac to take us for the weekend to Oklahoma City, to visit the Capitol and spend a night in a hotel, another first for many of us. Mrs. Kistler held out hope for us, hope we would be able to travel beyond western Oklahoma, and she whet our appetites. It's been said that hope is the fuel that moves us toward our goals. Little did I know that 35 years later, I would be working at that Capitol as an advocate for children and youth. As a college junior, I hoped to follow my boyfriend to University of Houston for my junior and senior year. But you should have heard my dad. No, not only no, but absolutely no. I would be leaving OSU, his alma mater, and that was heresy in our family. As you might imagine, a loud argument ensued, which took all the courage I could muster, along with my mother's supportive, hopeful attitude. That helped me enroll at U of H that fall, where I graduated with a bachelor's degree 2 years later. Ethereal. Hope often is described in metaphor. Emily Dickinson wrote in 1861, around 1861, and I know many of you know this poem. Hope is a thing with feathers that perches in the soul and sings the tune without the words and never stops at all. And sweetest in the gale is heard, and sore must be the storm that could abuse the little bird that kept us so many warm. I've heard it in the chillest land and on the strangest sea, yet never in extremity it asked a crumb of me. COVID-19 and the Delta variant requires everything we can do and then hope. Hope, according to Sheryl Sandberg, that we can grow from these difficult experiences. We can move forward. We can make it a priority to keep investing in the connections that have sustained us over the past year and a half. Our shared struggles are fostering deeper empathy and connectedness. We are more intentional going forward. Hope is a major force undergirding me as I have retired. Work is very valued in my family of origin, but before me spread out time to change my life. I could imagine many scenarios, but hope was the key to my decisions. Hope allowed me to create a new beginning.
When Deborah and I started planning this service earlier this summer, we identified hope as a spiritual guide and practice that is most relevant to these times. At that time, we were somewhat optimistic that the COVID vaccine would stymie the pandemic, that our lives would be returning to normalcy somewhat similar to pre-COVID days, that we would be celebrating today as being nearly the last church service by Zoom, and that we would be looking forward to greeting one another 2 weeks from today in our church sanctuary. We evoked several metaphors, emerging from the storm shelter to survey the damage after the flood has passed, and even the symbolism of the dove bringing the olive branch to the ark after the 40-day flood in Judeo-Christian and other religious mythologies, a concept of hope that Silver has so beautifully and articulately presented in the visual expression of this morning's service. Our expectations were tempered, however, by the realities and unpredictability of the world, and our thoughts turned to resilience and how we humans cope. Our conclusion was that hope keeps us going. I see faith, hope, and love as feminine, moral, and spiritual muses, sisters, probably because of my own identification as a female being, and because faith, hope, and charity, the word for love in the King James Bible version of this trio, are names often given to baby girls. Faith and love have been the subjects of many sermons, books, poems, movies, TV scripts. Hope has mostly been overlooked as a source of guidance and reassurance. Indeed, the state of our world could seem to make hope a spiritual fancy, not a dynamic, wise advisor. Conditions do threaten to overwhelm us. The Delta variant surge, the seemingly intractable pandemic that causes death and suffering and threatens our world order and economy. The images and tragic stories from Afghanistan, the random violence in our nation and across the globe, the rejection of science and rational inquiry, the lies and the strength they gain, the willful embrace of hatred, the destructive changes in our planet's health and ecology. The list goes on, and all feel as though they are existential threats. So how and where do we find hope? We hear a lot these days about resilience, raising resilient children, creating resilient communities, achieving resilient relationships, suggesting that resilience is where we find hope. Even our revered Unitarian forebear, Ralph Waldo Emerson, weighed in on resilience. Emerson, whose life could be a study in resilience, having endured the deaths of his 19-year-old wife and later his 5-year-old son, wrote, "Power ceases in the instant of repose." His recipe for resilience was get up and do something. It is the power to get up and do something that the pandemic and most of the larger issues of the world steal from us. So much is out of our control. And in fact, the message for dealing with the pandemic was, don't just do something, stand there. Don't go to work, don't go to church, don't visit your grandchildren, leaving us in an instant of repose, feeling powerless. Of course, we're not powerless, and many of us found ways to turn the passivity into opportunities. We were and are resilient. Resilience can help us survive, but it does not give us hope. Rather, hope gives us resilience. So, back to the question of where and how do we find hope? Author Elie Wiesel, who as a young man survived the Nazi concentration camps where his father, mother, and sister were murdered, and who could reasonably be expected to have little hope for the world, instead spent his life invoking our better angels. And he observed, hope is like peace. It is not a gift from God. It is a gift only we can give one another. How do we give one another the gift of hope? We find a good start in an apt metaphor coined by our friend Bob Hurst. All that is standing between us and the cold existential winds of the universe is the campfire around which we are gathered. We give hope when we help keep the campfire going. We give hope when we reach out to those who are scared, hurt, or grieving. We give hope simply by listening. We give hope when we share our moments of awe and inspiration and insight, an opportunity created for many of us by the daily email ritual created by Rodney Goddard starting at the onset of the pandemic. It is a personal connection and a touch that reminds us that we are not alone. We give hope through acts of bravery and courage. The rescue of hundreds of Afghanis by a group of our Special Forces veterans who did not have to, but who returned to Afghanistan and risked their lives on a daring mission last week to get 500 Afghani men, women, and children to the Karzai airport filled my heart with hope. We give hope through acts of resistance to hatred and lies. We give hope when we appreciate the good works of others, especially our fellow campers with whom we vehemently disagree. They too have gifts of hope to offer. We give hope when we extricate ourselves from the mire of anger and, as Deborah wisely expressed, do what we can, let go, and trust in the outcome. Heeding the observation of the French philosopher Alexander Dumas that all human wisdom is summed up in these two words, wait and hope. We give hope when we have countless opportunities, sometimes in big notable acts, but more often in seemingly ordinary small acts of kindness. The loss of our dear Jim Gordon last week has caused us to remember the ways he generously touched our lives through his witticisms, sterling observations, and genuine affection and love. Jim and Ruthie reached out to many of us in our darkest times. When the sands of my life shifted under my feet, they put their arms around me, literally and figuratively. The hope they fed in me continues. Others have similar stories. Jim and Ruthie made hope manifest. Our gifts of hope may outlive us, and we may find the gift of hope coming to us from those no longer with us. Dorothy Alexander, a lawyer and a poet and a good friend to many of us, recounts in her essay, Hope is the Thing with Metaphors, in the Summer Humanities magazine, how following the death of her son, she found hope through connection with poets, some through only the words they left. Dorothy writes, my reading led me to C.S. Lewis and his book, A Grief Observed, that chronicles his emotions following the death of his wife. Lewis's words became a lifeline, a strand that led me to the words of others who suffered great sorrows. As I delved further into what others had to say, my grief began to thaw. As I continued to read, I found my spirits steadily rising. Only in retrospect did I come to call this emotion hope. Dorothy also relates how she received a gift of hope from her son. Months after the death of my son, she wrote, I began to peruse his journals. There I found a notation dated only a few days before he died, quoting English poet Alfred Lord Tennyson. I couldn't help but take these words as a message to me from my dying son. Tennyson's words, hope smiles from the threshold of the year to come, whispering, it will be happier. The gifts of hope, precious as they are, do not insulate us from sorrow or fear or doubt. In fact, hope, by making us more attuned to life, may make us more vulnerable to the pain of the vagaries of life. Dorothy expressed the value of that side of hope, saying, the gift of poetry has not fully vanquished my grief. I do not wish to forget completely the feeling of sorrow, nor the pain of loss, because without those, I might close my heart to the sorrow and grief of my fellow beings. I might forget that we are all in this together. I might fail to look for and foster the hope needed for each of us to get through our one wild and precious life. Dr. Carl Deseroth, a psychiatrist on the Stanford University faculty, in his memoir, Projections, observes that tears come when we feel hope and frailty together as one. He recounts a man broken by the loss of his wife and their unborn child, but who could not cry, and suggests the man had no hope left to cry for. Dr. Deseroth's words are especially compelling, recalling a time with another patient to illustrate the gift of hope we offer just by being there. He writes, I could do something, not much, but something, and that matters, realizing at a place and moment you have been called to be whatever it is that humanity can be for a person. That is not nothing. So, do our gifts of hope to one another matter beyond their value in easing someone's pain or giving courage or strength or joy? The hope we feel and share gives us resilience to survive, but hope is so much more. Hope is a spiritual knowing. Again, quoting Emily Dickinson. Hope is the thing with feathers that perches in the soul and sings the tune without the words and never stops at all. Through hope, we see through the din and noise of the day to that unlimited and boundless eternity of which we are a part. Poet Matthew Olsman expressed this eternal essence of hope in his poem, Letter to a Bridge Made of Rope. The poem opens from the view of a shepherd looking up at the bridge, spanning the gorge where he's tending his sheep below. In his introduction of the poem, Reginald Dwayne Betts for the New York Times, whose own journey from teenage carjacker and prisoner to practicing lawyer is itself a gift of hope, says, the story is that familiar one of improbability, all the reasons we should hope, despite our eyes suggesting otherwise. Some of these days, you just want to remember the fragility of the bridge made of rope and how even on bad days, it has not let anyone down. Letter to a bridge made of hope, made of rope. Letter to a bridge made of rope. To the shepherd herding his flock through the gorge below, it must appear as if I walk on the sky. I feel that too. So little between me and the fall. But this is how hope works its craft. One foot set in front of the other, while the wind rattles the cage of the living, and the rocks down there cheer every wobble. your threads keep this braided business almost intact, saying, don't worry, I've been here a long time. You'll make it across. Blessed be.